Right, rethinking racial capitalism. It's very difficult to find a keynote for the conference, or it was difficult for us, because we thought, okay, racial capitalism is this buzzword, right? It's out there, and everyone is publishing something, and there are so many conferences and papers and articles around this. And a lot of this is really inspiring and interesting, but a lot of it is also quite frustrating, because you read it and you say, oh yeah, this is racial capitalism, but we don't really know what the racial part of it is, and we don't know what the capitalist part of it is sometimes, right? So we thought it would be great to have someone who has worked on this issue of understanding racism and capitalism in connection, and also on the notion of racial capitalism for years. And I guess we found somebody suitable. Or let's judge it after your talk. Yeah, wait for the talk, okay. But at least we're satisfied for the moment. And we're very happy that Gargi made her way all the way from the UK here to join the conference and to share her thoughts on rethinking racial capitalism. And of course, the title links to her book on rethinking racial capitalism, where she revisits the debates that Cedric Robinson has started and some others, but she merges them with some of the feminist Marxist debates that have emerged in recent years around social reproduction feminism, and also some other comments on post-colonial capitalism. I think Kalyan Sanyal's work is quite important also for your book. And we thought this take on racial capitalism as an open concept which comes from a Marxist, or is rooted in a Marxist tradition, but also is open for the post-colonial critiques, for the feminist critiques, for the anti-racist critiques that have existed for decades, is certainly an important starting point. And I'm really excited that you are here, Gargi, and you will talk about rethinking racial capitalism. I will not read out her entire biography or CV, because you can do that online. But I asked her before, when she started to work on the topic of racial capitalism, and she said about 15 years ago, there were a lot of conferences and workshops in the UK, and they were always titled like race and class, or race or class. And she was invited as a bridge between them. You want to choose class politics or identity politics. And she had a different take on this, right? And I think that's the time when she started to engage with the notion of racial capitalism, to reframe the understanding of what kind of anti-racist class politics we need today. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts now. So thank you for coming and for sharing your thoughts. And of course, you will not only be listening to her, you also have the chance to pose your questions, and also, maybe some comments at the end. So I think we have about 40, 45 minutes keynote, and then plenty of time for discussion and questions.
I know it's extremely cold. You may wish to move closer together. Thank you so much for having me. I mustn't move away from here because you need the... See, I'm a right fidget, and I find it very, very hard to stand still when I talk. So I'm going to move this one out here a bit and hope that works. And I'm going to try not to talk for a long, long, long time. Oh, yeah. And if you... Okay. How's that? No? I'll forget. Yeah, there we go. That is mine. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to try not to talk forever and ever, but it's easier said than done, isn't it? So I'll say a few things. Hopefully you'll say lots of things as well. I've already feel that someone has left, and I feel very guilty. It's because I said to them that they shouldn't say that Mao is a nationalist, and they wouldn't say that about Lenin, and they said, yes, they wouldn't say that about Lenin. And if you see that person, please apologise, because I wouldn't normally get into a fight, but it really prodded my wound. So anyway, my kids will understand why I feel so guilty about that. Okay. No, that's not. The button here. No, that. This one. Aha, okay. let's start by lowering expectations. That book is very, very, very old. A book that came out 5 years ago was written at least 10 years ago. That's how long it takes to write books. But much more importantly, that book is not at all written to shut down questions or to give you any kind of even overall analysis, let alone last word. It's a book that I write for myself in order to open up those questions, because I think what's at stake here is actually far more serious and important than you would ever understand by being in any academic conversation. I think people understand why I'm saying that. So, just in case, it really, 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 really is not a critique of Cedric Robinson or of anyone else. If anything, I'd like to celebrate Cedric Robinson, even though I don't agree with every single thing he ever said, as is the case with lots of people I've read who I'm very grateful to have read. I encourage you all to read with that frame of mind, because otherwise you're cutting off your noses to spite yourself. It is an attempt to collate some intellectual resources, because I think that's the job of people who have some time to read and talk, in the service of understanding what's killing us and what we might do to make it stop. And by us, I really do mean us, even if we're being killed at different speeds. So, what's happened in between? I'll go over here because I like to read my thing off the big thing. Right. A long, long time ago, when the last book was still in my head, I was interested in a few things. As Anil has already said, that there's a whole period in Britain in the earlier part of this century when there's suddenly this kind of, I don't know, the race or class debate took off in lots of policy and in political circles. And I'd be getting all these invitations as someone who was known for both being active in the labour movement and interested in class politics, but whose most of my writing was seen as to be about anti-racism. And every conversation started in the wrong place. It started as a battle between camps of understanding, not about the thing that was killing us. It made people speak to each other in ways that they could never make a connection about what was really at stake. And it just meant everyone goes away in a bad temper and no further forward and depleted. That's another thing I'd like to say to people, which I say in lots of spaces. There are few times when we have the time and energy and luxury to be together. Do everything you can to make sure that others are not depleted by the time they spend with you, and that you yourself are not depleted. Because our energy is together, that's what we have. So even though I know this is schoolwork, let us try and lift our spirits and temperatures a little bit in the time we're here together. So I started to try and write a book which started in a different place. So I knew I wanted to understand something about the role of a racialized dehumanization in the remaking of capitalism. I'd read Robinson much earlier as a graduate student, not that long after the book Black Marxism came out, and then hadn't really thought about him for about 30 years after that. I knew I wanted to understand something about the role of social reproduction as a space where different kinds of value might be scraped. I've been also formed by some debates in socialist feminism. They'd abated a bit in Britain, but little did I know that they'd be coming back with a vengeance. And I was certainly concerned to think about what difference climate catastrophe might be making to how capital remakes itself. And I think that's a question, we better all be thinking about. What we know now, a few years later, is, of course, how foolish of me. There are always new ways and new targets for dehumanization. You think you've seen the extent of what human evil and degradation and the kind of gasping towards death that can be imposed on people is, and yet something more happens. I don't think any of us can be living through the moment we're living in and not understand that. So that's something, that's our shared interest, isn't it? Regardless of who we think we are, who our affiliations are. As part of that, greater numbers have been pulled into the space of rendering up value through social reproduction. Some people have given papers that touch on that. I can't see who's in the room. Ashley gave the paper earlier about some of the ways in which welfare chauvinism works in Britain. But part of that is in the context of understanding that what we might have thought of as the standard worker, the waged labourer, the centrality of work to how we think about our global politics and the class struggle is getting dissipated away by the ways in which capital is remaking itself. The vast majority of people working in the world are so-called informal workers in the informal sector. The manners in which they work are all different. Actually, lots of us will, even us in the global north, in Northern Europe, even us working in the university, will work lots of different little bitty jobs. I know that there's a struggle going on here about those kinds of precarious conditions for colleagues in the room. That's also happening in Britain and in the States and in many places. All of that is kind of on the edge of how we might think of capital still wants my life force, but how is it taking it from me? Perhaps it won't always take it through the wage, or not only through the wage. Where are the other places that capital is taking my life force? What are the other techniques and technologies it's developing? And what do we do once we understand that those technologies are reaching right into the bits of our lives that we thought belonged to ourselves? I'm really going to have to speed up, aren't I? If I take this on for every slide, we'll be here tomorrow. Right. The other part was, when I was writing the first book, there was that brief moment when the world, I don't know if you remember, the World Bank report about climate catastrophe. It was like, aha, global bankers should know that ecological concerns are our concerns as well, because how will we make money when the planet implodes? They don't seem to think that now. Now they think, as far as I can discern, and people in the room might work on this more than I do, that there might be a version of survival for some in the face of climate catastrophe. That's actually my political hunch rather than my academic hunch, and I'd be really interested to pick that up, because that makes a difference. The move from when the kind of rulers of the global economy say, aha, aha, business as usual is up, look at the planet's on fire, to the move where they say, this is all terrible, but some of us will survive. What are the terms on which some of our survival will be? That seems to me like a pretty intensive challenge for all of us. And I'll try and speed up now. Speed up. Why bother to learn anything at all? I do often think that. These are very, very hard times. I know every generation of human beings who ever lived think they live in very hard times. But let's see. World on fire. A very, very rapid realignment across the global economy. I don't really get what global capital is doing now. And if people have got some points to make in the conversation, I'd really appreciate some actual conversation about that. But we're certainly seeing very, very great hardship, not only in spaces of conflict, but also different kinds of state collapse, different kinds of state implosion, other kinds of social political crisis. I think, and again in one of the sessions people said, oh, what about the state? I've got a real confusion about what the state might be in this period going forward. I do understand that in Germany it feels very different to in Britain, and that part of how I feel is because I live in Britain, that is corralling down a rabbit hole of absolute collapse. That if you wanted to see what a recently affluent nation going into infrastructural collapse looks like, you have to kind of live in Britain. I know there's some people in the room who live here, and you can cry with me or explain what I mean. But it's kind of tangible stuff every day. Another key bit of infrastructure shows itself to be in collapse. And although I do think some of that is Britain's karma and comeuppance for its extreme role of violence in the world, I also think it's a different kind of historical moment about what state forms can be in certain kind of in this moment of global capital. I'm not suggesting that there are not state forms in the large authoritarian conglomeration kind of new emerging nations who will rule the world and are ruling the world are not operating. But the kind of softly, just about liberal democratic centrist state of the European model and perhaps even of the North American model seems to me, at the very least, up to something else than it was earlier in my lifetime. And I'm sorry I'm talking so much. Hurry up, Gargi. All of this means there's something to learn. Something to learn. So better not read my slides. I can see that all of you, or not all of you who live here, and all of us who live somewhere else, don't know why, seem to be in some extremely bad-tempered non-conversation that I cannot comprehend. So I've said some things, but they're obviously off the mark. So I'll just try and say something, and you can then explain later what this non-conversation is about. I do not think that the debate about racial capitalism is a plea for inclusion to some uber-Marxist somewhere who will say, oh, at last, I see you dark-skinned people, you belong. It's not my interest. I don't think that's how that's happening. I do think that some forms of inclusion argument are important, not for ethical reasons, because in some ways, in the battle for us to survive and live lives that are something like life, the good manners of whether or not people are included is kind of neither here nor there, is it? As we die, for me to say, oh yes, I see that your religious beliefs are included, that's silly talk. I think that the only kinds of inclusion that matter for us in terms of theoretical models are the ones in which what is overlooked illuminates a question that has been overlooked, which is an important question. That's what I think that the framing of racial capitalism is about. It's not about saying, oh, you racist, you don't see us. It's saying, if you cannot understand the work that race has done in the formation of global capital, you cannot see how global capital remade itself. And that means you cannot see who you need to join with, how you need to join, or where the points of change towards your survival might be. You miss the whole game. This is called Cool Marx. I loved it, that picture. I thought, yes. So, I'm not going to propose it, because again, as I said, you're obviously having a fight here that's not my business. The kind of approach to racial capitalism that I've taken that reflects my own schooling and formation is one that is absolutely embedded in Marxism, emerges from it and remains attached to its analytic components, but raises an additional question. And the question is, how can we understand the non-emergence of a unified class subject, and how do we use our understanding of that to comprehend the disruption of solidarity arising from the adjusting process of capitalist remaking? So, two things. How come we're not free yet? I get up every morning and ask myself that. How is it that we are not free yet? Why am I living this life? Why is this all I have to give my children? I think you should all ask yourselves that as well. And what kind of thinking are we doing to understand what capital does to make sure we're not free yet? Doesn't remake itself in the same way all the time? What is that unevenness? What is that opportunism that's built into the model? How do we get to see it? Because our only hope of becoming free is learning how to see it. So I didn't check when I started. Did I start at, where's my chair gone? Can't see how. Did I start at 2:45? 15 minutes ago, great, thanks. So this is because I knew your department had post-colonial in the title. So I thought this was a part of politeness, isn't it? And so I come to visit you. They're much trickier. I think the project of post-colonialism is in part to register the ongoing trace of coloniality in the contemporary world, both in the various thwarted experiments in creating independence and the differently disguised violences of colonizing states. Broadly, this leads us to an analytic language that illuminates the structures and processes of extraction, exclusion, and rendering subject that continue with or without the formal framing of the colonial. I thought that's a pretty good summary. I'd use that again in a lecture. Those bits, they matter, don't they? If you want to know how the violence of the world is happening now, as well as the uncertain waged worker and the bits around it and the way that social reproduction becomes a space in which value is scraped, you might want to know about extraction, exclusion, and rendering subject. They feel to me like if you want to be free, whether or not you want to call yourself a Marxist, a post-colonialist, or I don't know, a Lutheran or something, you might want to know those things. I would suggest. Of course, I'm only visiting. Is it racial capitalism, though? I think that racial capitalism is also a way of describing the manner in which the particular machinery of accumulation in a location or moment is always an adaptation to and incorporation of the landscape of dispossession and exclusion. What I mean by that, which is not so snappy off your tongue, but I think gets the bits, is that racial capitalism is trying to describe what capitalist reproduction is in a way that registers what those prehistories always are. That the remaking of capital it's never year zero, is it? Who's been stolen from before? Who's been subordinated before? What's been extracted before? What resources have been siphoned from here to there before? That's always in the space of how capital then remakes itself. And it shapes how it remakes itself. And racial capitalism is also saying, do you know what? Without even having a thinking subject to say, oh, I hate those people, capitalist reproduction can do things where it says, oh, I'm an unthinking machine. But turns out those people have been non-humans for all this time. I wonder what I can squeeze out of that. Their lives and deaths don't even matter. I wonder what machinery I can build on that. It's a way of saying, look to the history in historical materialism, I would say. Okay, sedimented histories of dispossession. I'm going to be a bit quicker. Just as I love this point because this is for me alone, you won't. I was thinking about this. I was thinking this was a good example. Just as poor regulation has opened spaces into which capital squeezes, not necessarily seeking to cut the cost of labour or innovating through technology if labour can be, because if labour can be disciplined through the privations arising from poor regulation, then you don't have to do things like cut the cost and innovate through technology. What I meant by that is poor governance in a space can do the job of building better machines or squeezing a lower wage out because you can just get around people. That is actually a bit like your paper again as well. Sorry, I didn't mean it to be all, but it's kind of So if that's the case, other aspects of pre-existing unevenness or division or dispossession can also open their own opportunities for capital. That's what I think is one of the big insights of racial capitalism as a framing. That everything we know about uneven development then can make a different remaking, like it's sedimented layers of violence upon violence. It's not the absolute same remaking again and again. It's not just the same sequence, but oh, kick you, next step, next decade, kick you again. It's that how every minute of violence happens in capitalist history disperses people differently. It disperses the resources differently. It disperses the concentrations of productive possibility differently. And on that variegated landscape, which always has all this political argy-bargy involved in it, people get made as racially subordinated, and that becomes an opportunity in the next bit again and again. You set off this other spiral. Because capital is a shapeshifter. Oh, I have not been holding it close enough, have you? You need to tell me, because sometimes I forget to hold it high. So there's a whole bit when I'm just around here like this. You can hear some excitable person at the front waving their arms, but you don't know what I'm saying. That can't have been a good show. If I do that again, someone should wave at me and say, lift the mic, Gargi. Sorry, I am sorry. I'm not going to repeat myself. I'm going to try and hurry up instead. So you can ask me what I said when you couldn't hear anything. I went off on one, didn't I, about capital remakes itself on an uneven terrain that is of its own making, but that unevenness allows different formations to come up, kind of I did think of it as the Terminator. You know, in the old last Terminator films, or no one's watching anymore, but they've really got the kind of the visual tech really high up, so they do all these things. And not only do Arnold Schwarzenegger, they have all these different people. Capital is a bit like that, isn't it? It's a bit like the liquid one. Some of you are too young to even seen that, so I'll just do my... There's a liquid Terminator. What happens with liquid Terminator is you're fighting the Terminator. You think you're lopping their arms off or you're setting them on fire, and they'll just be like a pool of liquid kind of metal on the floor. And just when you think you're getting away, you think, I've won the class struggle now, yay, revolution, the Terminator gets up out of the pool of liquid metal and says, ah, ha, 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 capital can remake itself however it wants. And it gets you again. That's what this is about. It's much less an assertion of the primacy of something called race, and much more a method to bring to light the manner in which capital becomes a specific kind of shape-shifting monster in every site. That's what the story of racialized history of capitalism tells you. A different kind of shape-shifting monster in every site. And every time we, as living things, have tried to run out the door, I've been killing it with my weapons, I've been crushing it in these, I watch Terminator films a lot, you crush it in the metal crushing thing, doesn't matter, because it knows how to build every unevenness that we put before it into its own, back into its own body, and up it pops again. So why bother doing it? I didn't like it was a lion, but I didn't have time to change the picture. I don't think lions are part of the enemy. But I do think that our job collectively is to try to know the beast. The process of knowing it may uncover ways to slay the beast, or it might point us to what we do not yet know but must learn. But this form of knowing is not victory. Being able to say we know how it works is not the point, because the beast does not care what we think. And that, I guess, is, I can be as mean as I want because I'm going home tomorrow. When we speak to each other as people who have some time in our lives to read and write and talk, if we talk to each other as if getting the last word in is the same as winning the battle for life, we have missed the point of why we are studying them together. And when I say that you must, if at all possible, heed my painful wounds as an older person and try not to deplete each other when you are with people of goodwill, that's part of it. Because we are part of the resource, and our ability to understand collectively, that's part of the resource. And we're not making the argument. There is not some king capitalist will think, oh no, they've seen the trick now, and then it's not Wizard of Oz. Then they don't, kind of implode in a ball of smoke. That doesn't happen. Right, too much writing. Have to hurry up. Okay, 25 minutes. Look, I'm not going to read that out. I'm interested in why and how social reproduction is part of the remaking of racial capitalism. I've tried and think about the arena of social reproduction not only as a supplement to the wage, but the broader arena in which life is remade, and that for much of humanity, for much of human history, and still for much of the world, for an increasing number of the world, is the space in which capital reaches into something called the realm of social reproduction, because there's no wagedness, or only temporary, partial, occasional wagedness. But in that realm of social reproduction, which should be remaking life, instead value is scraped back into capital. There's different kinds of extractivism. There's new forms of extractivism, I think, through platformization. There's old forms of extractivism through indebtedness, which are spreading far more, but I'm interested in that. And I think I don't have to argue this anymore. That moment of welfarism where we thought that oh, we're only fighting about what goes around the family wage. That's gone. It's gone here, it's gone everywhere, lots of places it will never reach, so I don't have to persuade you that. Right. I need to remind myself why I want to tell you this. Oh, yeah, okay. The imposition of slow or quick death through positioning as marginal or excluded or as stuff, as nature, as product, might be understood as a racializing technology. Someone else, I can't remember who, I learned something lovely about this mumble time thing. I'm going to take that away as my thing. I don't know if any of you didn't get to have that, but apparently here when people talk, then you have a bit afterwards called mumble time, and everyone just chats to their friends, and that's beautiful, and I think that's really replenishing. And in my mumble time, you were one of them, and someone else I was in my mumble time with was talking about, are there people who are migrants who are racialized and migrants who are not racialized? And I was saying, actually, I think that the techniques of bordering themselves make people racialized, because 20 years ago, you could walk around Britain and no one would have told you that a Polish person was a racialized minority. Let me tell you, every single person, Poles and not Poles, will now tell you, yeah, absolutely, these are part of because they made it. The Labour regimes made it, the bordering regime made it. So in a similar way, rather than thinking there's a landscape of the economy and some bodies bring race to it and some bodies don't, what happens in that space of state practice, economic dispersal, social positioning, that's what makes race. And it makes it again and again in lots of ways. Okay, and I already told you this thing about the family wage before. Didn't realise I've written it on the next slide. Okay, I've got a whole section now on social reproduction. Am I going to get through both bits? I've got a whole section on social reproduction, and I've also got a whole section on the new beasts. What do you think? 15 minutes. I think I might, or I hate it, I think I might just flick through the social reproduction bit, and I can send it to you if you want, and tell you about the new beasts, because that will really cheer you up. And then we'll go home, then we'll chat, and then we'll go home. Okay, good thinking. So it does hurt me, because I love these points, but I think we can't. And look, they had the zombie pictures, but... right. Okay. These are the bits that I think I should say to you. I do think people like the term racial capitalism because it sounds like you don't have to think too hard anymore because it's a totalizing promise, isn't it? All of the devils have been named. I know it now. I know that people want answers, and this sounds like that is it. But I don't think that's in the spirit of the project. Because, as I've already said, the logic of accumulation leads to endless innovation. It's not just the same theatre of dispossession again and again. And whether or not we think this is something worse than capitalism, I was going to talk about all this techno-feudalism discussion, and maybe other people raise it. What we're living through is volatile, unpredictable, and demanding of our analytic attention. So I've written another book about racial capitalism, much to my children's amusement. I told them I came to this thing, and they said, oh, they're all your fan club then. I said, oh, because they're into racial capitalism. And you even said, oh, I couldn't be like, you'll have that answer. Anyway, I won't write any more books about racial capitalism after this. But I still from this assumption that someone is always losing and becoming expendable as capital is reconstituted. And racialization or something like it comes into play as populations, both new and old, are imagined to be expendable. Alongside this, I've also been thinking that, as I've just said, that there's some escalating adaptation of state and state economy interactions. There's something really enormous that I don't really have the expertise to get to, but I'm trying to get into my sights, about the shift in corporate forms and what that shift means for other sectors, and that longue durée issue about how climate crisis reframes class interests. I've already said this, racial capitalism is a way of understanding the process through which capital divides and disperses populations. It excludes some, setting the terms for economic inclusion for others. That sedimented history continues to shape where we are, but we don't leap out of that history. But at the same time, there's a new violence happening all the time. You can't predict where you'll fall, how people will fall, what kind of fall they'll have. So, beasts of our time. Bordering. I know that quite a lot of people in the room work on bordering, so you all probably have more to say about this than me. I work a bit about bordering in the UK, less so recently. All of this, if you're awake and reading the papers or just reading the runes of the times, you know it. Climate crisis is very likely to rapidly increase the proportion of the world's population on the move. We already know some of that. Probably, I think we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of what we'll predict, both within and across borders. Instead of migrant receiving, migrant sending, perhaps we're seeing a shift to within states, between states. And perhaps we should no longer imagine inclusion entitlement as achieving the status of being settled. I think there's a big question about what happens in a time of climate catastrophe, which means that the landscapes of settlement, entitlement, citizenship, just really are very much in movement, not in movement. They're just uncertain for us, aren't they? Uncertain for us, the globe, not just here. Alongside that, I should have put the names of the beasts, and I'm sorry that some people have seen these beasts before. State violence. I might previously have understood state violence as part of the segmenting and disciplining of the working class. That's certainly how I've been trained to think about police violence and prison violences. Keep us all in our place, further stigmatise one segment of the working class, it works for everyone. So that violence for some is part of ensuring compliance for others. The idea that, you can kill some black blokes and Arab blokes and it will help wash a kind of jingoistic disciplining across the rest of the working class. The uncertain relationship between state and capital, something undergoing shifts with outcomes that are yet to be decided, in my view, leads to some turbulence in the disciplining of populations. If capital no longer wants the same kinds of docility from workers, and I know that I'm asking you to just accept something I've not argued, but I do think work is not the same, it doesn't happen the same way, not in the same rhythm, it might not be work for very many of us, then the state machineries that are meant to make us docile don't seem quite right anymore, are they? The role of policing and prisons also becomes under question if the docility of workers, non-workers and sometime workers is in shift. And what is regarded and demanded as economic productivity also shifts, including changing the spatial dispersal of production and accumulation. That's my whole kind of confusion about what platforms do. So I think we might have to adjust our sense of criminal justice as a mode of disappearing populations, although I have been very schooled in that. These three. Platformisation. And I've listened to some excellent papers about commodity chains and related things today. Platformisation has led to a further dispersal of commodity chains, plus some shifts in geography of production, with a return to something like workshop manufacturing for some, many consumer goods, it seems. I'm interested in that, but it's not time to talk about it. What happens when you demassify production? The differentiations of racial capitalism have implied a different settlement around the divisions within the labour market and in the relation between differing forms of economic activity. that settlement probably isn't so apt for how the emerging global economy is coming. The fragmentation and dispersal of previously massified modes of production, I know it's long-standing, also suggests an increasing excavation of value for capital from the realm of social reproduction. So, platforms kind of spread out where making happens, they spread out where work happens, they break lots of the different established modes of employment, they cut the ways in which urban formations might be linked to the remaking of capital, because platforms don't need cities really anymore. That's not their business. And all of that means that the worker, non-worker, sometimes worker as a racialized triptych happens differently. People might have more to say about that. Piece 4, the world on fire, of course. Much of what we understand about the racial capitalism of the past rests on the manner in which racialized subordination of some populations has played out as a fix for overaccumulation. I didn't explain what that means, but I'll assume you know it. Survival for some is imagined as death for others. And the sedimented histories of racial capitalism, plus the changing configuration of capitalist reproduction in a time of changing corporate forms and uncertainty about the role of the state for capital, shapes who is imagined to be savable, but not entirely. Sorry, I shouldn't have just read that out. All I'm saying is that in this moment when the super rich and global financial institutions and perhaps some others are imagining that they can ride out climate catastrophe, they just build the walls higher and let more of us fall in the water and the fire and the damnation. There is a racialized element, but it's not a completely predictable racialized element. And that bit of unpredictability means that we should all be alert and afraid. I don't know what else to say about that. And what is it? Okay. And try and think of the end bits. I've lost my way a bit. Sorry about that. It's too distressing. I can't talk about it. Like, oh, yes, we can understand it, but there might not be time to fix it. There's no point using the frame of racial capitalism as a claim for equal treatment. That's missing the point completely. But if we don't think about racial capitalism, at least the questions that it raises as a framework, I don't think we can really begin to think about collective survival. I think we should try and remain curious about the workings of racial capitalism, which isn't... I've done that thing again, haven't I? None of you told me. Now I can hear myself. Okay. Because racial capitalism isn't a repeated chorus. I know it is kind of exciting to suddenly be working in a field that everyone is working in, but I think all of you must have heard papers where it sounds like, not here today, of course, but in your lives, where it sounds like racial capitalism is already the answer, and it's always the same answer, and everywhere you look, it's just racial capitalism again. Oh, and look, the same thing happened to the same people, the same protagonist, the same victim, oh, the same story again and again and again. That's not our business to understand that. Our business is to remain curious, because as capital remakes itself, remember, pulling itself out of the pool of liquid metal to kill us in new ways every time, we need to know what's coming. So you can't afford to be lazy or uncurious or just predictable, repetitive. Because unless we're curious, how will we know how to build a politics where we can relate to each other and build something like survival? That, I think, is the end. Right. This is the last bit. If it really works, and I know this is often not the case, but let's be, even though I've talked you into despair, let's try and end on a high note. Intellectual work comes to life in concert with movements, we hope. It's lovely to read on your own. It's lovely to write on your own, but it's not enough, is it? We know that's not going to save us. I could write the most knockout knock your socks off piece of writing tomorrow. That would not be it, would it? It's in concert with other kinds of activity and movement. And that's why we, including everyone who's having the fight that I'm going to leave tomorrow, scrabble about reaching for authentic connections, perhaps running too fast, me, perhaps spreading themselves too thin, also me. But I can't imagine a constellation towards survival and freedom that does not include varieties of human creativity, analysis, and imagination. And those are things we must do together. And seeking to know the beast at this time when really I can't tell you how frightened I feel for younger people. I feel frightened for my own children. As a species, we've lived through some challenges, but this is like this make or break moment, let me tell you. Seeking to know the beast is the only way I know of trying to articulate what is to be done. And I hope that it's something that you'd like to do together. And I'll go home, but you'll have to live with each other. Thank you for having me.